In 1894, the Redcliff Children's Academy in Portland, Oregon claimed to house over 200 orphan children, yet city records show only 47 ever left alive. The imposing brick structure on Forest Hill stood as Portland's pride for nearly 3 decades, its Gothic spires reaching toward heaven, while unspeakable horrors festered in its basement corridors. What began as philanthropist Edmund Redcliff's vision of Christian charity became a systematic nightmare that consumed an entire generation of forgotten children. The screams that once echoed through those halls have long since faded, but the questions remain. How did an entire community turn blind eyes to the disappearance of so many? And why do the surviving records tell such different stories than the witnesses who dared to speak? The institution's reputation. The Redcliff Children's Academy opened its doors on October 15, 1871, amid great fanfare and municipal celebration throughout Portland, Oregon. Edmund Redcliff, a wealthy lumber magnate who had made his fortune in the post-Civil War timber boom, announced his intention to create a sanctuary for the Lord's most vulnerable lambs. The Gothic Revival Building, constructed at a cost of $180,000, an astronomical sum for the frontier territory, dominated the landscape of Forest Hill with its imposing stone facade and soaring bell tower that could be seen from the Willamette River. Redcliff himself cut an impressive figure in Portland society, which was still establishing its social hierarchy in the rapidly growing territory. Born to modest circumstances in Ohio, he had traveled west in 1862 with little more than determination and a keen eye for the emerging timber industry. By 1870, his sawmills employed over 600 workers across 5 facilities stretching from Portland to the Oregon coast, making him one of the territory's most influential businessmen. His marriage to Catherine Whitmore, daughter of a prominent San Francisco banking family, cemented his position among the Pacific Northwest's emerging industrial elite. The couple's tragic inability to have children of their own was whispered about in Portland's drawing rooms, but publicly, Edmund channeled this disappointment into what appeared to be genuine philanthropic zeal. The Academy's founding documents, preserved in the Oregon Historical Society archives, paint a picture of noble intentions that reflected the territorial period's optimistic belief in human improvement through proper guidance. "We shall provide not merely shelter and sustenance," Redcliff wrote in his founding charter, "but moral instruction, practical education, and Christian discipline to prepare these unfortunate souls for productive lives, in service to our great nation as it expands across this magnificent continent." The institution was designed to house up to 300 children between the ages of 6 and 16, with separate dormitories for boys and girls, extensive classroom facilities, workshops for vocational training, and what was then considered a state-of-the-art infirmary, equipped with the latest medical equipment available in the Pacific Northwest. The Academy's early years seemed to justify Portland's considerable pride in the institution. Local newspapers regularly featured glowing accounts of the children's progress, emphasizing how the facility demonstrated the territory's commitment to civilized values despite its frontier status. The Oregon Statesman of March 1873 described a visit to the institution. "One cannot help but be moved by the sight of these once wretched waifs, now clean, well-fed, and eager in their studies. Mr. Redcliff has indeed wrought a miracle of Christian charity that stands as a testament to what enlightened leadership can accomplish, even in these Western territories." The children performed at community events throughout Portland and the surrounding Willamette Valley, their choir singing at church services, territorial celebrations, and civic gatherings. Their neat uniforms, dark blue for boys, gray for girls, became a familiar and reassuring sight on Portland's muddy streets, symbolizing order and progress in a community still defining itself. The Academy's staff appeared equally impressive, representing a level of educational sophistication that surprised many visitors to the Oregon Territory. Headmaster William Harris arrived from the prestigious Phillips Academy in Massachusetts, bringing with him impeccable credentials and a reputation for firm but fair discipline that had been tested in New England's most demanding educational environments. His decision to accept a position in the Western Territories was seen as a significant coup for the Academy and for Portland's aspirations to cultural respectability. The teaching staff included graduates from normal schools across New England and several from established institutions in California, representing an unprecedented concentration of educational expertise in the Pacific Northwest. The Academy boasted one of the few fully equipped chemistry laboratories west of San Francisco, a library containing over 3,000 volumes and workshops fitted with machinery imported at considerable expense from Eastern manufacturers. Dr. Charles Baker, the institution's physician, was a Harvard Medical School graduate who had served as a Union Army surgeon during the Civil War before seeking opportunities in the developing Western Territories. His appointment to the Academy represented a significant investment in the institution's medical capabilities, as qualified physicians were scarce in Oregon during this period. Dr. Baker's medical practice extended beyond the Academy to serve Portland's growing population, making him one of the territory's most respected healthcare providers. His decision to establish a permanent residence in Oregon and dedicate significant time to the Academy's mission was viewed as evidence of the institution's serious commitment to the children's welfare. Financial records from the period show the Academy operating with apparent efficiency and transparency that impressed potential donors throughout the Pacific Northwest and beyond. Annual reports, distributed to Portland's leading citizens, territorial officials and potential donors in California and the eastern states, detailed expenditures for food, clothing, educational materials, and staff salaries with a level of specificity that was unusual for charitable institutions of the era. The institution received regular donations from timber companies, shipping concerns, agricultural businesses, and prominent families throughout Oregon Territory and beyond. Eastern philanthropists, impressed by reports of the Academy's work, contributed significant sums to support what they viewed as a crucial civilizing influence in the Western Territories. By 1875, the Academy's endowment had grown to over $400,000, ensuring what seemed like permanent financial stability and the capacity for future expansion. The children themselves appeared to thrive under the Academy's care, at least according to contemporary accounts that were widely circulated to demonstrate the institution's success. Former residents who left the Academy in its early years spoke positively of their experiences when interviewed by territorial officials and visiting journalists from Eastern newspapers. Thomas Lambert, who spent 4 years at the Academy before being apprenticed to a Portland printing establishment in 1876, recalled in a 1923 interview, "Mr. Redcliff treated us like his own children, perhaps better than many children received from their natural parents. We had good food, warm beds, and the finest education available anywhere in the Oregon Territory. I learned to read and write there, skills that served me well throughout my life in the newspaper business." The Academy's reputation extended far beyond Portland's borders, attracting attention from educational reformers, government officials, and charitable organizations throughout the Western Territories and beyond. Educational reformers from across the Pacific Coast visited to study its methods, often publishing favorable reports that enhanced both the Academy's reputation and Portland's growing status as a center of enlightened governance. A comprehensive report published in the American Journal of Education in 1877 praised the institution's innovative approach to combining rigorous academic instruction with practical training specifically adapted to the needs of Western development, noting that Academy graduates consistently found employment in respectable trades or continued their education in higher institutions throughout the Pacific Coast region. Religious instruction formed the cornerstone of the Academy's program, as was expected and demanded by the conservative Protestant community that dominated Oregon Territory during this period. Daily chapel services, extensive Bible study, and moral instruction occupied significant portions of the children's schedule, reflecting the era's conviction that proper moral development was inseparable from practical education. The Academy's chapel, with its soaring vaulted ceiling and magnificent stained glass windows, donated by prominent Portland families and territorial officials, served as the spiritual heart of the institution and as a symbol of the community's commitment to Christian values. Visiting ministers from throughout the Pacific Northwest regularly praised the children's devotion and the depth of their religious knowledge, often using the academy as an example in their sermons about the possibilities for moral transformation through proper guidance. The academy also gained recognition for its progressive approach to vocational training, which was specifically designed to prepare children for the economic opportunities available in the developing Pacific Northwest. Boys learned carpentry, metalworking, printing, and basic engineering skills that were essential to the region's continued development, while girls studied domestic arts, needlework, basic nursing, and teaching skills that would enable them to contribute to the territory's civilizing influence. The institution's workshops produced furniture, textiles, and printed materials that were sold throughout Oregon Territory and Northern California, providing both practical training for the children and additional revenue for the academy's operations. This combination of education and production was viewed as particularly well-suited to frontier conditions, where self-sufficiency and practical skills were highly valued. Edmund Redcliff's personal involvement in the academy's daily operations was legendary throughout Portland and became a significant part of his public reputation as a benevolent patriarch. He maintained a fully equipped office on the academy premises and was said to know every child by name, their background, and their particular strengths and challenges. His wife Catherine, though often in delicate health due to the Pacific Northwest's damp climate, organized charitable events throughout Portland society and personally supervised the girls' domestic training programs. The couple's dedication to their adopted children became a source of inspiration throughout Oregon Territory, earning them numerous civic honors and social recognition that extended their influence far beyond the business community. By 1880, the Redcliff Children's Academy had become more than just a charitable institution. It was a symbol of Oregon Territory's progressive values and Christian compassion, representing the region's aspiration to combine frontier practicality with Eastern sophistication. The imposing building on Forest Hill stood as a testament to what private philanthropy could accomplish when guided by moral purpose, practical wisdom, and adequate financial resources. Territorial officials regularly brought distinguished visitors to tour the facility, and the academy was featured prominently in promotional materials designed to attract new businesses, settlers, and investment capital to Oregon. The institution's success was cited as evidence that the Pacific Northwest could maintain civilized standards while developing its abundant natural resources. The academy's apparent success during this period masked subtle changes in its operations that would later prove significant but were either unnoticed or deliberately ignored by Portland's leadership. Staff turnover, initially low due to the academy's generous compensation and prestigious reputation, began to increase after 1878. Several experienced teachers and administrators left without clear explanation, their positions quickly filled by individuals with less impressive credentials, but apparently greater loyalty to Edmund Redcliff's increasingly specific vision for the academy's mission. The children's public appearances, once regular features of Portland's social calendar, became less frequent, and their contact with the broader community gradually diminished in ways that were explained as necessary for maintaining focus on their educational development. Nevertheless, the academy's reputation remained intact and even enhanced as Oregon prepared for statehood. Annual reports continued to show healthy finances, successful graduate placements throughout the Pacific Northwest, and grateful testimonials from former residents who had established themselves in respectable positions throughout the region. The institution had become so thoroughly integrated into Portland's identity and Oregon Territory's aspirations that questioning its methods or outcomes seemed almost unthinkable to the communities. Leadership. The Redcliff Children's Academy was, by all public accounts and official documentation, exactly what it claimed to be, a beacon of hope for society's most vulnerable members and a demonstration of what enlightened philanthropy could accomplish in America's developing territories. Ignored signs. The first documented concerns about the Redcliff Children's Academy emerged in the winter of 1881, though they were dismissed at the time as the malicious gossip of disgruntled former employees seeking to damage the reputation of Portland's most respected charitable institution. Sarah Mackenzie, a teaching assistant who had worked at the academy for 18 months before her employment was terminated for what officials termed unsatisfactory performance and attitude, approached Portland's mayor with disturbing allegations about conditions within the institution. Her claims were recorded in a brief memorandum, found decades later in the city archives, filed away in a miscellaneous correspondence folder, and apparently forgotten by everyone except the clerk, who had been instructed to preserve all documents related to municipal affairs. Mackenzie reported that children were regularly punished through prolonged isolation in basement cells that bore no resemblance to the temporary discipline rooms described in the Academy's official procedures manual. She claimed to have witnessed children being deprived of food for days at a time as punishment for minor infractions, subjected to what she termed medical procedures that bore no resemblance to standard healthcare practices, and forced to participate in activities that she described as experiments conducted by Dr. Baker under conditions of absolute secrecy. Most troubling, she alleged that Edmund Redcliff himself participated directly in these punishments, often working late into the night in the academy's lower levels, where staff members were strictly forbidden to venture without specific authorization and escort. Mayor Jonathan Phillips, a longtime friend of Redcliff and significant beneficiary of his political donations during Portland's transition toward statehood, dismissed Mackenzie's allegations as the hysterical fantasies of a woman whose employment was terminated for incompetence and whose moral character had been called into question by her supervisors. The official response, preserved in Phillips's correspondence files, stated that the city had complete confidence in Mr. Redcliff's Christian stewardship and the Academy's vital mission to the unfortunate children of our territory. Mackenzie was warned in writing against spreading malicious falsehoods that could damage Portland's reputation, harm the welfare of the children she claimed to be protecting, and potentially interfere with Oregon's statehood aspirations by suggesting that territorial institutions were inadequately supervised. Similar complaints surfaced sporadically throughout the early 1880s, each dismissed with increasing efficiency by local authorities who had developed a standard approach to handling criticism of the academy. Robert Anderson, a former groundskeeper, whose employment had been terminated after he was discovered removing tools from academy property, reported seeing children's graves being dug in the academy's private cemetery far more frequently than could be explained by normal mortality rates for a healthy population of institutionalized children. His concerns were attributed to his known problems with alcohol consumption and his bitter feelings following his dismissal from academy employment. Martha Hayes, a seamstress who provided specialized services to the academy and had maintained contracts with the institution for over 5 years, claimed that the number of children's uniforms she was asked to alter, repair, and replace each year greatly exceeded the number of children she observed during her regular visits to the facility. Her observations were dismissed as the confused recollections of an elderly woman whose business relationship with the academy had recently been terminated in favor of younger competitors. The pattern of dismissal became so routine by 1883 that Salem's authorities had developed what amounted to a standard response protocol for complaints about the academy. Allegations were invariably attributed to the personal failings of the accusers: mental instability, moral corruption, financial desperation, political motivations, or simple malice stemming from employment disputes or business conflicts. The city's primary newspaper, the Oregon Daily Journal, was heavily dependent on advertising revenue from Redcliff's timber operations and related businesses, making its editors reluctant to investigate or publish any stories that might cast doubt on the academy's reputation or suggest inadequate municipal oversight of charitable institutions. More troubling signs emerged from the children themselves during the academy's increasingly rare public appearances, though these warnings were even more effectively suppressed through a combination of official explanations and community pressure to maintain Portland's positive reputation. On several occasions between 1882 and 1884, children attempted to communicate with outsiders during the Academy's carefully managed participation in church services, civic celebrations, and educational demonstrations. Lucy Price, a milliner's assistant whose shop was located near one of Portland's primary churches, later recalled an incident from 1883 when a young girl from the Academy's choir grabbed her arm after a Sunday morning performance and whispered urgently, "They're hurting us, please help us, they do terrible things." Before Price could respond or ask for clarification, Headmaster Harris intervened immediately, explaining to Price and other witnesses that the child suffered from nervous disorders and fantastical delusions that caused her to make attention-seeking claims that bore no relationship to her actual experiences at the Academy. The Academy's isolation from the broader Portland community became more pronounced during this period, though the changes were implemented so gradually and with such plausible explanations that they attracted little notice from community leaders who were increasingly focused on Oregon's impending statehood and the economic opportunities it would bring. Public tours of the Academy, once regular occurrences that were featured prominently in Portland's social calendar, became rare events limited to carefully selected visitors who were provided with highly scripted presentations that emphasized the institution's achievements while restricting access to most of the facility. The children's choir appearances, which had once been regular features at churches throughout Portland, dwindled significantly and then ceased entirely in 1884, a change that was explained as part of a shift toward more intensive academic focus designed to better prepare the children for their eventual integration into Oregon's developing economy. The Academy's annual reports, which had previously provided detailed information about individual children's progress, educational achievements, and successful placements in apprenticeships or continued education, became notably less specific during this period, offering vague summaries and general statistics rather than the concrete examples that had previously demonstrated the institution's effectiveness. When questioned about this change by potential donors and community leaders, Academy officials explained that increasing concerns about the children's privacy and future prospects required greater discretion in public reporting, particularly as Oregon prepared for statehood, and the increased scrutiny that would accompany full integration into the United States. Perhaps most significantly, the flow of children leaving the Academy through successful completion of their education slowed dramatically during the early 1880s, though this change was masked by the institution's continued claims of maintaining a stable population of approximately 200 residents. In the Academy's early years, approximately 30-40 children per year had been successfully graduated to apprenticeships, employment opportunities, or continued education at other institutions throughout the Pacific Northwest. By 1884, that number had dropped to fewer than 10 per year, despite the Academy's continued claims of housing over 200 children and receiving new residents on a regular basis. When questioned about this discrepancy by territorial education officials, Edmund Redcliff explained that the Academy had adopted more rigorous educational standards and was taking greater care in preparing children for the challenges of adult life in a rapidly developing society, suggesting that longer periods of institutional care were necessary to ensure successful outcomes. Dr. Charles Baker's role in the Academy's operations also evolved during this period in ways that should have attracted attention from Portland's medical community, but were either overlooked or deliberately ignored by professionals who benefited from Baker's referrals and consulting services. His private practice, once thriving and serving many of Portland's most prominent families, gradually diminished as he devoted increasing time to what he described as specialized research and treatment protocols at the Academy. Colleagues in Portland's small but growing medical community noted his increasing secretiveness about his work, his growing interest in what he termed experimental therapeutics, and his reluctance to discuss specific cases or treatment methods with other physicians. His orders for medical supplies, processed through distributors in San Francisco and occasionally from Eastern suppliers, included unusual quantities of surgical instruments, chemical compounds, restraint devices, and preservation materials that seemed excessive for a children's institution, even one with a well-equipped infirmary. The Academy's financial records, still dutifully published each year as part of the institution's commitment to transparency, began to show peculiar patterns that should have raised questions among the donors and civic leaders who reviewed them. Expenditures for food and clothing remained relatively constant despite the allegedly stable population, while costs for medical supplies, facility maintenance, and specialized equipment increased dramatically year over year. Most curious were significant payments to a company called Specialized Transport Services, which, according to incorporation records filed in Sacramento, existed solely to provide discrete relocation assistance for sensitive institutional needs. Investigation of this company's operations revealed no physical address, no regular employees, and no other institutional clients, suggesting that it existed primarily to serve the Academy's specific requirements. Local tradesmen and service providers who maintained business relationships with the Academy began to report increasingly strange requirements and unusual working conditions that departed significantly from normal institutional maintenance and supply protocols. James Franklin, a carpenter who had performed regular maintenance work on the Academy buildings since 1875, was required beginning in 1882 to sign elaborate confidentiality agreements promising never to discuss what he observed during his visits to the facility. His work orders increasingly involved extensive modifications to basement areas, including the installation of reinforced doors with complex locking mechanisms, the construction of additional rooms with specialized ventilation systems, and the improvement of drainage systems that seemed designed to handle unusually large volumes of liquid waste. When Franklin questioned the need for such extensive underground construction, he was told that the Academy was developing advanced educational facilities and specialized treatment areas that required particular environmental controls to ensure the health and safety of the children. The Academy's private cemetery, located on a secluded portion of the institution's extensive grounds, also attracted attention from the few municipal officials who were positioned to observe patterns in mortality reporting and burial practices. Henry Wallace, the territorial clerk responsible for processing death certificates and maintaining vital records, noted that the Academy reported an unusually high mortality rate among its residents, nearly double the rate observed in similar institutions throughout California and the eastern states. When he raised these concerns with territorial health officials, he was told that the Academy served particularly disadvantaged children whose previous experiences of neglect, malnutrition, and exposure to disease made them more susceptible to illness despite the institution's excellent care. The deaths were invariably attributed to common ailments that were endemic to frontier conditions: influenza, tuberculosis, heart failure, accidents, and complications from pre-existing conditions that had resulted from the children's unfortunate circumstances before their admission to the Academy. More disturbing were reports from the few outsiders who had occasion to visit the Academy's grounds during evening hours or other times when normal institutional activities should have been concluded for the day. Night watchmen employed by neighboring properties, delivery drivers who occasionally needed to access the Academy during unusual hours, and others whose work brought them near the institution after dark reported seeing lights in basement windows at all hours of the night, hearing sounds that seemed inconsistent with normal institutional operations, and observing unusual activity around the Academy's rear entrance where deliveries were received and waste materials were removed. These reports were consistently dismissed as the product of overactive imaginations influenced by the institution's Gothic architecture, Portland's notorious fog and rain, and the general atmosphere of mystery that naturally surrounded any large institution operating during nighttime hours. The pattern of ignored signs extended beyond Portland's borders to include correspondence and interactions with other institutions throughout the Pacific Northwest and beyond. The Academy's official correspondence with schools, employers, and other organizations that had previously accepted Academy graduates revealed growing difficulty in placing children who had allegedly completed their education and were ready for integration into adult society. Schools that had previously welcomed academy graduates for continued education began declining to enroll them, citing vague concerns about behavioral problems, adjustment difficulties, and unusual responses to normal educational environments. Employers who had once eagerly hired academy-trained workers became increasingly reluctant to do so, though they were hesitant to explain their reluctance in writing or provide specific examples of problems they had encountered. By 1885, the accumulation of ignored signs had created a situation where willful blindness had become the established community standard for dealing with any criticism or concerns about the Academy's operations. Portland's leading citizens, territorial officials, and business leaders had so thoroughly invested their reputations and political standing in the Academy's success that acknowledging problems would have required admitting their own complicity in ignoring obvious warning signs and failing to exercise proper oversight of an institution they had publicly championed. The Academy continued to operate with apparent community support and official approval, its dark secrets protected by a conspiracy of silence that involved not only institutional officials but also civic leaders, government officials, and community members who had chosen reputation and political convenience over the welfare of the children the institution claimed to serve. Horror uncovered. The first crack in the Redcliff Children's Academy's carefully maintained facade came not from persistent investigation or courageous exposé, but from a simple structural failure that forced access to areas that had been strictly forbidden to outsiders for more than a decade. On March 18, 1894, a major water pipe burst in the Academy's basement level, flooding several rooms and forcing emergency maintenance workers to access underground areas that had been consistently off-limits to all staff members, except those specifically authorized by Edmund Redcliff and Dr. Baker. What they discovered in those flooded chambers would finally shatter Portland's willful ignorance and expose horrors that defied contemporary understanding of institutional abuse, challenging the community's fundamental assumptions about civilization, progress, and the treatment of society's most vulnerable members. George Mitchell, the experienced plumber called to repair the damaged pipes and assess the extent of the flooding, later testified before federal investigators that his first indication something was fundamentally wrong came from the overwhelming smell that greeted him when he descended into the Academy's basement. It wasn't just dampness and mold from the flood, he told investigators in testimony that was recorded in shorthand and preserved in federal archives. There was something else, something that made my stomach turn and my hands shake as I tried to light my lamp. When I finally got the lamp working properly and looked around at what the water had revealed, I understood why that smell was so terrible, and I knew I was seeing things that no decent person should ever have to witness. The flooded basement revealed an extensive network of cells, each approximately 6 feet by 8 feet, constructed with heavy stone walls and equipped with iron doors that featured complex locking mechanisms clearly designed to prevent escape from the inside. The cells had no windows, minimal ventilation, and floors that were stained with substances that defied immediate identification but created patterns suggesting long-term exposure to various fluids. The walls bore extensive scratch marks that appeared to have been made by fingernails, along with what looked like desperate attempts to carve messages or simply to mark the passage of time through crude tallying systems. In several cells, Mitchell discovered restraint devices that had been permanently mounted to the walls and floors, including metal shackles, leather straps, and wooden contraptions that appeared designed to immobilize human subjects in specific positions for extended periods. Mitchell's discovery prompted a broader investigation that was initially resisted by local authorities, but eventually mandated by federal officials who had received reports of the plumber's findings through channels that bypassed Portland's municipal government. What investigators uncovered over the following months can only be described as a systematic program of abuse, experimentation, and murder that had been operating for more than a decade. Under the cover of charitable work and educational mission, the Academy's basement had been converted into what federal investigators would later characterize in their official report as a laboratory of human suffering, featuring facilities that had been specifically designed not for education, rehabilitation, or even punishment in any conventional sense, but rather for the methodical brutalization of children under the elaborate guise of medical research and moral correction. Dr. Charles Baker's medical records, seized during the federal investigation after local authorities proved unable or unwilling to secure them properly, revealed the true nature of his experimental therapeutics and provided detailed documentation of procedures that violated every principle of medical ethics then recognized by the profession. His meticulously maintained notes, written in a clinical style that made their contents even more horrifying to readers, documented systematic procedures performed on children as young as 7 years old without any form of anesthesia or pain management. These included surgical operations designed to test the limits of human endurance, the injection of various chemical compounds to observe their physiological and psychological effects, and elaborate psychological experiments specifically designed to measure what Baker termed the breaking points of the human spirit under controlled conditions. Baker's personal justifications for these procedures, recorded in his private journals and correspondence, invariably referenced scientific advancement, moral purification, and the greater good of human understanding. His writings revealed a man who genuinely believed that his work represented a crucial contribution to medical knowledge and social progress, despite the obvious suffering it caused to his subjects. He maintained extensive correspondence with physicians and researchers in Europe who were conducting similar investigations, participating in what appeared to be an international network of medical professionals who shared data about their experiments on institutionalized populations. The children at the academy were not residents, students, or even patients in any meaningful sense. They were laboratory subjects whose suffering was systematically documented, analyzed, and shared with other researchers for what participants claimed was the advancement of human knowledge. Edmund Redcliff's personal journals, discovered hidden behind a false wall in his private office during the federal investigation, provided even more disturbing insights into the Academy's true purpose and the philosophical framework that had guided its operations from the very beginning. Far from being a charitable institution that had gradually become corrupted, the Academy had been conceived from its inception as a facility for conducting experiments that would have been impossible in more visible settings or with subjects whose disappearance would be noticed and investigated. Redcliff's entries revealed a man who viewed orphaned and abandoned children as providential resources for advancing human knowledge, their rejection by society making them ideal subjects for research that civilized sensibilities and conventional moral restrictions might otherwise prevent. The physical evidence uncovered during the federal investigation painted a comprehensive picture of systematic torture that had been disguised as institutional discipline and medical treatment. The basement cells contained restraint devices of sophisticated design that had clearly been custom manufactured for specific experimental purposes, featuring adjustable components that could accommodate subjects of different ages and sizes. Chemical analysis of stains found throughout the lower levels revealed the presence of human blood, various acids and caustic substances, compounds consistent with embalming and preservation fluids, and residues from drugs and chemical agents that had no legitimate medical applications. Most disturbing were the anatomical specimens preserved in sealed containers throughout Baker's laboratory areas, clearly human in origin and bearing evidence of surgical removal from living subjects who had been kept conscious during the procedures. Survivors of the Academy's horrors began coming forward as news of the federal investigation spread throughout Portland and the surrounding territories, though many were initially reluctant to speak due to years of conditioning that had convinced them their experiences would not be believed or would be attributed to mental instability. Mary Sullivan, who had escaped the institution in 1887 by hiding in a laundry cart during a routine delivery and had survived on Portland streets rather than risk recapture, provided testimony that corroborated the physical evidence and filled in crucial details about the Academy's daily operations. "They would take children during the night," she told federal investigators in testimony that was recorded verbatim. "You would hear screaming for hours, sometimes all night long, then complete silence. In the morning, we would be told that the child had been transferred to a better situation or had graduated to advanced placement." We learned very quickly not to ask questions about the children who disappeared, because asking questions meant you might be selected next. Sullivan's detailed account of daily life at the academy revealed an institution that had been systematically designed to break children's spirits and prepare them psychologically for more extreme forms of abuse. Children were awakened before dawn each day for what was officially termed moral instruction, but actually consisted of sessions that combined religious indoctrination with sophisticated psychological manipulation designed to convince them that they deserved whatever punishment they received, and that resistance or complaint would only result in worse treatment. Food was used as a weapon of control, with meals withheld for days at a time, to reinforce lessons about obedience, gratitude, and the children's complete dependence on their caretaker's mercy. Physical punishments for minor infractions were deliberately disproportionate and unpredictable, creating an atmosphere of constant fear and uncertainty that made organized resistance or rebellion virtually impossible. Helen Brooks, another survivor who had managed to escape the academy in 1889 and had been living under an assumed name in San Francisco, described in detail the selection process for children who would be taken to the basement laboratories for Baker's experiments. "Dr. Baker would examine us regularly," she testified before federal investigators. "These weren't normal medical examinations. He would ask very strange questions about our families, our dreams, our deepest fears, and what we thought about when we were alone. He would watch our reactions very carefully and take extensive notes. Those children who showed what he called interesting responses would be marked for special treatment. We could always tell when someone had been marked because they would become very quiet and very scared. They knew what was coming, even if they couldn't explain exactly what would happen to them. The Academy's staff had been carefully selected over the years, not for their educational qualifications or experience with children, but for their willingness to participate in or ignore the institution's true activities without question or complaint. William Harris, the headmaster who had arrived with such impressive credentials from prestigious Eastern institutions, maintained detailed records of each child's progress through various stages of what he termed character reformation and moral development. His personal notes, seized during the investigation, revealed a systematic program of psychological abuse specifically designed to identify children who would be most suitable for Baker's experimental protocols, while eliminating those who showed excessive resistance or resilience that might interfere with research objectives. The federal investigation also uncovered extensive evidence of a broader network of institutions throughout the Western Territories that were engaged in similar activities under the coordination of what participants called cooperative research initiatives. Correspondence found in Redcliff's files revealed connections with orphanages, hospitals, schools, and other charitable institutions from California to Washington Territory, all participating in what they described as scientific research designed to advance understanding of human psychology, physiology, and moral development. Children were regularly transferred between these facilities, their movements documented in coded language that disguised the true nature of their treatment and made it virtually impossible for outside authorities to track individual cases or identify patterns of abuse. Financial records seized during the investigation revealed that the Academy's operations were funded not primarily by charitable donations from well-meaning community members, but by substantial payments from medical schools, pharmaceutical companies, government agencies, and private research foundations that were interested in the data being generated by the experimental programs. The children were literally being sold to the highest bidders, their suffering monetized through contracts that treated them as research materials rather than human beings. The true profits from these transactions were hidden through complex accounting schemes designed to maintain the facade of charitable operations while generating substantial income for the participants in what amounted to a systematic program of human trafficking. Perhaps most horrifying was the discovery of the Academy's private cemetery, which was found to contain far more graves than had ever been officially recorded in municipal death records or the institution's public reports. Exhumation of selected burial sites, conducted under federal supervision with appropriate medical and legal protocols, revealed evidence of surgical procedures, chemical exposure, traumatic injuries, and other forms of physical abuse that were entirely consistent with the experimental programs documented in Baker's detailed records. Many of the bodies showed signs of having been preserved with chemical agents for extended periods before burial, suggesting that some children had been kept alive during prolonged experimental protocols that lasted weeks or months before resulting in death. The scope and systematic nature of the atrocities uncovered at the Academy challenged contemporary understanding of institutional abuse and forced federal investigators to develop new frameworks for comprehending what they had discovered. What had been initially dismissed by local authorities as isolated incidents of excessive discipline was revealed through careful investigation as a comprehensive program of human experimentation that had systematically consumed hundreds of children over more than 2 decades. The investigation's findings were so disturbing that several members of the federal investigative team required extended medical treatment for psychological trauma, resulting from their prolonged exposure to the evidence and survivor testimony. As word of the discoveries spread beyond Portland and the Oregon Territory, the Academy case attracted national attention and international scrutiny that threatened to damage America's reputation during a period of territorial expansion and international competition. Medical journals throughout the United States and Europe published articles questioning the ethical standards of American research institutions and calling for increased oversight of charitable organizations that served vulnerable populations. Child welfare advocates used the Academy case to argue for federal legislation requiring systematic inspection and regulation of institutions that housed children, while critics of American expansion pointed to the case as evidence that frontier conditions inevitably led to moral deterioration and institutional corruption. The evidence uncovered during the federal investigation filled more than 200 boxes and required months of careful analysis and documentation by teams of investigators, medical experts, and legal specialists who worked to reconstruct the full scope of the Academy's operations. The physical brutality revealed in the basement chambers was matched by the psychological sophistication of the programs designed to break children's spirits and prepare them for increasingly extreme forms of abuse. The institution had operated as a comprehensive system for converting society's most vulnerable members into experimental subjects, their suffering justified by elaborate claims of scientific and moral advancement that revealed the dark potential of progressive-era optimism about human perfectibility through systematic intervention and control, legacy, and silence. The exposure of the Redcliff Children's Academy's systematic horrors should have resulted in swift justice, comprehensive accountability, and fundamental reform of institutional oversight throughout the Pacific Northwest and beyond. Instead, it triggered one of the most comprehensive and sophisticated cover-ups in American institutional history, demonstrating the extraordinary lengths to which established power structures would go to protect themselves from the consequences of their complicity, and the devastating effectiveness of coordinated efforts to suppress inconvenient truths. What followed the initial federal investigation was a masterclass in the systematic suppression of evidence, witness intimidation, and institutional memory manipulation that left survivors without justice while ensuring that similar horrors could elsewhere without meaningful oversight or public awareness. Edmund Redcliff's death on April 3, 1894, just 16 days after the basement discovery became public knowledge, was officially ruled a heart attack brought on by the stress of what his personal physician described as false and malicious accusations against his beloved charitable work. The timing was remarkably convenient for all parties concerned, as was the immediate cremation of his body, despite his wife's previously documented preference for traditional burial in the Redcliff family plot. With Edmund dead, the primary target for criminal prosecution was eliminated, and the federal investigation began to lose momentum almost immediately as key witnesses became reluctant to testify and crucial evidence began to disappear. Through channels that suggested coordinated interference with the judicial process, Dr. Charles Baker disappeared entirely on April 10, 1894, leaving behind only a carefully worded note claiming that he had been called to his important work in service to humanity at an unnamed European institution that had recognized the value of his research and offered him opportunities that were not available in America's increasingly hostile environment. Despite extensive efforts by federal marshals and international law enforcement agencies, Baker was never located, though unconfirmed reports from various sources placed him at medical facilities in Austria, Germany, and eventually Argentina for years afterward. His complete disappearance removed the second key figure who could have provided detailed testimony about the Academy's operations, its connections to broader networks of institutional abuse, and the specific individuals and organizations that had funded and supported the experimental programs. The surviving physical evidence began to disappear with alarming efficiency through what appeared to be a coordinated campaign involving multiple levels of government, law enforcement, and private interests. On April 15, 1894, a fire of unknown origin completely destroyed the Academy's administrative building, consuming most of the institutional records that had not yet been transferred to federal custody and eliminating documents that could have revealed the full extent of the Academy's operations and connections. The basement laboratories were quickly sealed and filled with concrete by municipal workers, officially for public safety reasons, but effectively eliminating the crime scenes before thorough forensic analysis could be completed. The Academy's private cemetery was declared a health hazard by territorial officials, and its contents were relocated to unmarked graves in a municipal cemetery, making future investigation or identification of victims virtually impossible. Catherine Redcliff, the Academy founder's widow, announced her complete willingness to cooperate fully with federal investigators while simultaneously filing an extensive series of lawsuits challenging the legal authority of federal agencies to seize her husband's personal papers, examine the Academy's private records, and interfere with what she characterized as legitimate business operations protected by territorial law. Her legal challenges, supported by some of Portland's most prominent attorneys and funded by sources that were never fully disclosed, successfully delayed legal proceedings for months while evidence continued to disappear and witnesses became increasingly reluctant to participate in investigations that seemed unlikely to result in meaningful prosecution or justice. The survivors who had courageously come forward to testify about their experiences found themselves facing a coordinated campaign of intimidation, discreditation, and systematic harassment that was clearly designed to destroy their credibility and discourage others from speaking out. Mary Sullivan, whose detailed testimony had been crucial in corroborating the physical evidence discovered in the Academy's basement, was arrested on charges of public intoxication and disturbing the peace just days before she was scheduled to provide additional testimony to federal investigators. These charges, though never proven in court, were strategically timed and widely publicized in ways that made her appear unreliable as a witness and called into question her mental stability and moral character. Helen Brooks faced even more serious accusations, including prostitution, theft, and mental instability, allegations that were never substantiated with credible evidence but were effectively circulated through Portland's social networks. In ways that completely undermined her credibility in the minds of potential jurors and community members. The systematic character assassination of survivors followed patterns that suggested professional coordination, involving planted stories in newspapers, strategic rumors circulated through business and social networks, and carefully orchestrated legal challenges that forced survivors to defend themselves against false accusations rather than focusing on their testimony about the Academy's crimes. Other potential witnesses simply disappeared entirely under circumstances that suggested deliberate intervention rather than voluntary relocation. Thomas Lambert, the former Academy resident who had initially provided positive testimony about his early experiences, but was prepared to testify about changes he had observed in the institution's operations, vanished from his Boston boarding house in May 1894, leaving behind unpaid rent, personal belongings, and no indication of his intended destination. His landlord reported to federal investigators that strange men had been asking detailed questions about Lambert's daily routines, work schedule, and personal associations in the days immediately before his disappearance. Several other potential witnesses met similar fates, their sudden disappearances creating a climate of fear and intimidation that effectively discouraged anyone else from coming forward with information about the Academy's operations. The federal investigation itself was systematically undermined through what appeared to be administrative incompetence and bureaucratic inefficiency, but followed patterns that strongly suggested deliberate sabotage by individuals with access to official files and investigation procedures. Key pieces of evidence were repeatedly misfiled, lost, or destroyed through apparent clerical errors that always seemed to involve the most damaging materials. Witness statements disappeared from official files, crime scene photographs were damaged or mislabeled, and crucial documentation was transferred between agencies in ways that made it virtually impossible to maintain chain of custody or ensure the integrity of evidence. The federal prosecutor initially assigned to the case, who had arrived in Portland with considerable enthusiasm for pursuing criminal charges against Academy officials and their supporters, gradually became less aggressive in his approach to the investigation, citing evidentiary challenges, procedural complications, and jurisdictional issues that made successful prosecution increasingly unlikely. His transformation from aggressive prosecutor to reluctant participant was so dramatic that it attracted attention from other federal officials, but inquiries into his change of approach were deflected through bureaucratic channels and never resulted in meaningful investigation or explanation. Portland's business community, territorial officials, and social leaders rallied to protect the city's reputation and their own political and economic interests through a coordinated public relations campaign that was remarkable for its sophistication and effectiveness. The Academy scandal threatened to severely damage Portland's carefully cultivated image as a progressive, well-governed community that was ready for statehood and worthy of continued federal investment in territorial development. A comprehensive campaign to minimize the significance of the discoveries and redirect public attention toward positive aspects of Portland's growth and development involved newspaper editors, civic leaders, religious officials, and business organizations working together to control the narrative surrounding the Academy case. Local newspapers, heavily influenced by advertising revenue from businesses owned by Academy supporters and territorial officials, gradually shifted their coverage from investigation of the allegations to increasingly critical coverage of the federal investigators themselves. Editorial writers began questioning the motives of federal authorities, suggesting that the evidence had been misinterpreted or exaggerated, and arguing that the entire scandal was being exploited by political enemies who wanted to delay Oregon's statehood or damage the territory's reputation for their own purposes. The story gradually disappeared from local coverage entirely, replaced by positive features about Portland's industrial growth, cultural achievements, and bright prospects for the future. The Academy building itself became a powerful symbol of the community's determination to move beyond the scandal and maintain the narrative that the institution had been fundamentally sound despite isolated problems that had been greatly exaggerated by outside agitators. Rather than being demolished or converted to another use that might serve as a reminder of what had occurred there, the building was purchased by a group of local investors who announced plans to restore it as a monument to the thousands of children who received excellent care and education within its walls over more than 2 decades of distinguished service. The restoration project, which was never actually completed but was extensively publicized, served to reinforce the official narrative that the abuse allegations had been greatly exaggerated and that the Academy's positive contributions far outweighed any isolated problems that might have occurred. National attention to the Academy case also faded with suspicious rapidity. despite initial widespread interest from newspapers, magazines, and reform organizations throughout the United States. Medical journals that had initially published articles questioning research ethics and calling for increased oversight of charitable institutions began publishing rebuttals and corrections that minimized the significance of the Academy discoveries and suggested that the allegations had been exaggerated or misunderstood. Child welfare organizations that had initially demanded comprehensive reform of institutional oversight gradually shifted their focus to other issues, often citing resource limitations and competing priorities that made continued attention to the Academy case impractical. The few federal officials and local investigators who attempted to pursue the case despite mounting obstacles found their careers mysteriously derailed through transfers, demotions, and administrative actions that effectively ended their involvement in the investigation. The federal prosecutor who had initially led the case was reassigned to a remote posting in Alaska Territory, officially for administrative reasons, but effectively ending his ability to working on Academy-related prosecutions. Local investigators who had been most aggressive in pursuing leads and gathering evidence found themselves facing internal disciplinary actions for procedural violations exceeding their authority and failure to follow proper protocols. The message was unmistakably clear to anyone in law enforcement or government service. Pursuing the Academy case too vigorously was a career-limiting decision that would result in professional isolation and administrative retaliation. By 1896, less than 2 years after the initial discoveries that had shocked the nation, official records of the Academy investigation had been classified, sealed, or transferred to federal archives where they were made inaccessible to researchers, journalists, attorneys representing survivors, or anyone else who might seek to investigating the case or pursuing justice for the victims. The few documents that remained in public files had been heavily redacted, with names, dates, locations, and other crucial information removed or obscured in ways that made them virtually useless for any practical purpose. The systematic suppression of evidence was so thorough and comprehensive that future researchers would find it nearly impossible to reconstruct the full scope of the Academy's operations or identify the individuals and organizations that had supported and enabled the systematic abuse of children. The survivors who remained in the Portland area found themselves living under a cloud of suspicion and hostility that made normal life virtually impossible. Community members who had initially expressed sympathy and support gradually turned against them, influenced by carefully orchestrated whisper campaigns that portrayed them as liars, criminals, mentally unstable individuals, or opportunists seeking attention and financial gain through false accusations against respected institutions and community leaders. Several survivors were forced to leave Portland entirely, their reputations so thoroughly destroyed that they could not find employment, housing, or social acceptance in the community where they had suffered so terribly. The Academy case established a comprehensive template for institutional cover-ups that would be replicated with devastating effectiveness countless times in subsequent decades whenever powerful institutions faced exposure of systematic abuse or corruption. The combination of legal challenges, evidence destruction, witness intimidation, media manipulation, bureaucratic sabotage, and community pressure proved devastatingly effective in preventing accountability and ensuring that similar institutions could operating without meaningful oversight or public scrutiny. The sophisticated techniques developed and refined during the Academy cover-up would resurface again and again throughout American history, whenever powerful interests faced inconvenient revelations about their activities or the consequences of their negligence. Perhaps most tragically, the successful suppression of the Academy scandal ensured that the hundreds of children who had suffered, died, and disappeared within its walls would never receive justice, acknowledgement, or even basic recognition of their suffering and humanity. Their names were systematically erased from official records, their graves were unmarked and eventually forgotten, and their stories were silenced by a community that chose reputation, political convenience, and economic interests over truth, justice, and the welfare of society's most vulnerable members. The Academy's victims became non-persons in the most literal sense, their existence denied and their suffering erased by the very society that had failed to protect them in life and abandoned them in death. The Redcliff Children's Academy case stands as a permanent monument to the extraordinary power of institutional silence and the devastating complicity of entire communities in protecting their own interests at the expense of truth and justice. The building on Forest Hill eventually collapsed from deliberate neglect in 1923. Its ruins quickly cleared away to make room for a municipal park, where Portland families now gather for picnics and community events, while children play on recreational equipment installed directly over the ground where torture chambers once operated. No memorial marks the site, no plaque acknowledges what happened there, and the official history of Portland contains no mention of the Academy's true legacy or the systematic cover-up that followed its exposure. The techniques of denial, misdirection, intimidation, and institutional memory manipulation that were perfected during the Academy cover-up have become standard operating procedures for powerful interests throughout American society. When facing inconvenient revelations about their past activities or current operations, the case serves simultaneously as a warning about the vulnerability of truth to coordinated suppression efforts and as a detailed roadmap demonstrating both the necessity of holding institutions accountable and the sophisticated methods they routinely employ to avoid such accountability when their interests are threatened by exposure of systematic wrongdoing. In the end, the Academy's most lasting and destructive legacy may be the precedent it established for the systematic suppression of institutional abuse scandals through coordinated efforts involving government officials, business leaders, media organizations, and community institutions working together to protect their collective interests. The children who died in the Academy's basement chambers were not its only victims. Their tragedy was compounded and perpetuated by an entire community's deliberate choice to value reputation over truth, political stability over justice, economic interests over human welfare, and institutional preservation over accountability. That fundamental choice continues to echo through American institutional life more than a century later, representing a dark inheritance that remains largely unacknowledged, unaddressed, and tragically influential in shaping how powerful institutions respond to exposure of systematic abuse and corruption. If this story impacted you, if you stayed until the end, it's because you feel these hidden truths also need to be exposed. So leave in the comments the city you're watching from. This way we can see how far these stories are reaching, and subscribe to the channel. There are many other cases the world tried to forget, but we insist on remembering